Welcome everyone to our webinar today titled NACOE Local Government Heavy Vehicle Route Assessment Guidelines, Geometric Assessment, Part 2. Next slide, please. My name is Isabella and I'm moderating the session today. Next slide, please. We plan to go for 60 minutes with time for questions. Next slide, please. We'd love to have your input, so you see here on the slide how to send your questions through. Now we are following the government guidelines and all coming from our home offices, so fingers crossed all our technology works. And we also have Neva and Rosie from ARRB joining in for tech support. Next slide, please. So our presenters today are Kieran Hay, Senior Professional Engineer, Transport Safety, ARRB. Next slide, please. And we also have two guest presenters today who are available for questions throughout this presentation. They are David Milling, Team Leader, Transport Safety, ARRB, Larry Griffiths, Principal Engineer, Road Manager Policy, Heavy Vehicles and Prosecutions, Department of Transport and Main Roads. Okay, let's get started and we'll now be hearing from Kieran.
Thanks, Isabella. Great to be back here again for, I think, the fourth of our sessions. And thanks, Dave and Larry, for joining us on this. All right, so yeah, as I mentioned, this is the fourth session in our 5-part webinar series. And as I said yesterday, this session is also going to be looking at the geometric assessment of a route. So this is part 2 of that, which is, I guess, covering the last half of the new content in the guide. So again, we'll also be doing some examples towards the end of the webinar presentation. And we'll also be looking at a bit of a risk assessment process when we do identify any deficiencies in that route. So again, this is just a quick overview of what sections in the guidelines will be covered in this webinar session, and each of these sections has new guidance in them in comparison to the existing guides. So during this webinar, we'll touch on each of these sections, and the sections that we'll be looking at are mainly from the road geometric side of it, and those are vertical alignment, sight distance, intersections, railway level crossings, and overtaking. So the key additions that have been made are new guidance specifically for unsealed roads in a number of areas, new guidance for sight distance in low-speed constrained environments, a revised method for applying clearance times, and new guidance for overtaking opportunities and overtaking in the opposing lanes. So to assist users in their route assessments, we've also developed a flowchart that describes the assessment process based on the road area. So this includes mid-blocks, intersections, and rail crossings. And it basically just shows what attributes need to be assessed based on each area of the road. So as a quick example, if you're looking at rail crossings, then there's only really 2 attributes there that need to be assessed. So this is aimed at helping to streamline the overall process. And so you can see at the bottom, it does help to guide the decision-making process. So if we go through the route assessment and we determine if each attribute meets the guide, then it's either a pass or a fail. And if it does fail those recommended guidelines, then there are additional steps that you can take to determine if you can grant access or not. And one of those is using the mitigation treatments from the guide itself, and the other one is using a risk assessment process to apply other mitigating treatments. So throughout this session, we'll only be looking at sections of the guide which have new or updated guidance in comparison to old guides. So this means a lot of the areas of the guide itself are not covered specifically in this webinar series. So the first area that we're going to be looking at is the vertical alignment. So we've provided some new guidance for grades on unsealed roads in this. And And these grades provide a general maximum value. It doesn't mean that that is a standard or anything like that, so it is just a guide. So if you do actually exceed these on any of the routes, there are additional assessment criteria that can be looked at to determine if it actually is suitable. And it is worth noting that even if the route is under those grade limits, ascending and descending effects should still be checked, because there is a possibility that it could still exceed the guidance in the ascending and descending effects. So the other sections that we've got here, so new guidance for stopping sight distance on unsealed roads specifically. So that's a new addition to this. And we've got a few little diagrams on the right there that kind of show how stopping sight distance is typically measured. So the overall method of determining your stopping sight distance does remain the same. So sight lines can be established from the driver's eye height to the ground level, to the object on the road surface, or to the top of the car, or even if operations are required at night, to the tail lights or the stop lights. So that hasn't really changed from any previous method. It's just stating that those are options. And there is guidance for assessing stopping sight distances on curves provided in table notes. So this is for additional considerations if curve radii is too small or the approach speed is too high. And we'll look at that a little bit later in the session when we start looking at the examples. And like always, the stopping sight distance is measured along the travel path in the lane. And again, that's shown in those figures on the right there. So in this guide, we have two separate tables for sealed and unsealed roads. So this is due to different skid resistances between the two, which really affects the actual distance it takes for a vehicle to come to a stop. Road managers can identify if sight distance should be provided from driver eye height or to either the road surface or the roof of a car. So it really depends on what level of risk you're willing to accept. In some situations, it may be more beneficial to use to the top of the car rather than to the actual road surface itself. It's just it's something that would need to be documented in a risk assessment process. That's all. So here we've just got another quick example, and I think I've already shown a lot of these in the past sessions as well, just showing how that's actually assessed. And like most of the criteria in the guidelines, it's just assessed based on a table which you can plug in the values that you're using. So in these cases, it's just a B-double vehicle operating at 80 kilometers per hour on a level grade. And then it also shows here that those sight distances for sealed roads, or the stopping sight distances for sealed roads and unsealed roads, there is a bit of a difference in between those. So it is quite critical that you are using the correct tables for the specific types of roadways. One of the other sections is the approach sight distance. So again, there is new guidance for that on unsealed roads. And it also provides new guidance for low speed constrained environments as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So the approach sight distance is assessed for heavy vehicles stopping for traffic control devices. So give way sign, stop sign, traffic lights, anything like that. And the approach sight distance is measured along the travel path in the lane to the holding line. So up on the top right here, so this is that low speed constrained environment stuff that I was talking about just before. So it's basically using a reduced reaction time in specific situations. So it's usually where it's usually where the driver has alert driving conditions. So they have a high expectancy of stopping due to traffic signals or consistently tight alignments for example, mountainous terrain. So it's where drivers are alert and they do expect to be stopping. That could be in a number of different areas, and it does provide just a slightly different way of measuring that. Obviously, in certain areas there is less space, so there could be less sight distance available. However, if the driver is alert going through those areas, then they may not require as much time to stop or to brake. So the approach sight distance values for unconstrained environments, we'll still use the stopping sight distance values from the previous section that we looked at. So this is mainly around those low speed constrained environments here. And yeah, so this does have approach sight distance for other vehicle types as well. So this is just an extract of that, just to show that there is different values for sealed roads and unsealed roads. And it does go on to talk about larger vehicle types, such as your type 1, type 2 road trains, and then also your PBS level 3 and 4 vehicles. So that is just an extract there, and additional guidance is provided for those vehicle types. One thing of note on these tables is that low speed in this case is determined as less than or equal to 70 kilometers per hour. So these tables can't be used for anything greater than that. And if the speed in those areas is greater than that, then the typical stopping sight distance tables should be used. And we do have some examples of this towards the end of the session, which kind of go through and explain that a little bit better. So again, for safe intersection sight distance, again, we've got new guidance for unsealed roads, and yeah, that's a bit of a trend here. Lots of new guidance for those types of roads. Other than that, safe intersection sight distance, not a lot of changes there. It's assessed for a heavy vehicle on the major road, so the through movement, and it's measured along that travel path in the lane. And it's slightly different to some of the other ones because it is measured as the travel path in the lane to the probable conflict point. So the figure in the top right kind of shows that it's the distance to where a collision could take place. And there's a lot more guidance on that in the guidelines, and it kind of steps through how to determine that and how to measure it. And yeah, also each possible conflict point in the route's lane should be considered, not just the first one. So again, just the tables from the guidelines. So this is just showing sealed versus unsealed, and again, you can see that there is a difference in those criteria there. Yeah, it's similar to the last couple of sight distance sections that we've looked at. I guess the main difference between this guide and some of the previous ones is that there is more emphasis on unsealed roads, so it does provide that additional guidance in regards to that, where we've seen a lot of local governments that have requested more guidance around unsealed roads. All right, so enough about sight distances for now. So now we're looking more at the intersection side of the route assessment itself. So this part here is more clearance times. So previously, clearance times was classified as green times for intersections, which didn't really make sense in the situation of a unsignalized intersection. So instead, it's now being retermed as clearance times. So this allows a road manager to modify signals and hardware and programming to cater for access, but it also allows you to use this for unsignalized intersections based on headway of vehicles. So clearance times can be used to assess maneuvers at signalized and unsignalized. So this includes right turns from a median, and that's where that headway part comes in. So if your headway between vehicles is greater than your clearance time, then that's great. And up in the top right there, we've got a little diagram, a chart, a table showing the clearance times, and we've got two different types of clearance times. So there's using normal acceleration and using cautious acceleration. So this gives a little bit of leeway in either direction. Typically, cautious acceleration is used by livestock vehicles and any vehicle that's carrying dangerous goods, while a normal acceleration is just for any other freight vehicle. So the clearance distances, we've got a little figure in the bottom right there that does show how it's measured. So it's measured from the hold line or the stop line to the point at which the tail of the vehicle clears the intersection. So that's what that distance is. And then you can see in the table on the top right how to apply that. So if you do have a 35-meter clearance distance, then you can calculate what the clearance time is for that. So there's also a little bit of additional guidance around how to assess a low-speed swept path and what level of clearances are required between the vehicle and any infrastructure or other lanes or line markings on the intersection. So we've got a lot of these diagrams that detail the required offset distances, and this is to, like I said, roadside objects, cyclists, opposing vehicles, adjacent vehicles, etc. And we can see in the table on the right there, it does have some diagrams that demonstrate this, and then it also provides a bit of descriptive text to show what that actually means, and then the required distance. So for example, at an unsignalized intersection where you've got two opposing turns, there should be a 1 meter distance offset between the two vehicles. So again, this slide shows two swept paths for the same intersection, and one shows the movement being completed with the vehicle remaining in the leftmost turn lanes, while the other is switching between lanes. So this is another thing that's kind of covered underneath this guide, is what to do in these situations and whether that's possible to use. So it does provide a lot of additional guidance around low speed swept paths. So one of the sections that is relatively brand new in this guide is more focused around overtaking of heavy vehicles on really any road type. So one of the things that we've done is we've put in this flow chart, which really details the process to undertake that overtaking assessment. So this also includes consideration of access under permit conditions. And you can see there that flow chart is quite extensive and it does walk you through the process quite well. So this is all included in the guide as well. So yeah, don't stress about trying to save that picture from this presentation or anything. So there's a few things that were added. So there's overtaking level of services, consideration and use of a TRA assessment, and overtaking in the opposing lane and time spent in the opposing lane to complete the maneuver. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. So that first one that was mentioned was the overtaking level of service. So it affects the operational efficiency and safety of the road. And it also takes into consideration the delay that drivers may experience when they're stuck behind a heavy vehicle. So one of the ways to really assess this is a TRA assessment. So it's a traffic and rural roads assessment, which identifies the level of service along the length of a road if a heavy vehicle was to be given access. So the TRA assessment identifies how and where overtaking opportunities should be provided to improve the level of service if that access is given. And we can see up in the top right, so it's got recommended level of services based on desired heavy vehicle access. So if the access that was given was just general access or level 1 PBS, then the level of service would be C. However, as you go up to higher levels, it does increase. So type 2 road trains or PBS level 4, the recommended level of service would be B. So this gives other road users plenty of opportunities to overtake those heavy vehicles. There is research that's been done that states that vehicles travelling behind heavy vehicles for prolonged periods of time are more it's more typical for them to proceed in risky overtaking manoeuvres, which is something we don't want to see on the road. So the second part of that is overtaking in the opposing lane. So if overtaking sight distance is available for a heavy vehicle, for a vehicle to overtake a heavy vehicle, using the opposing lane, consideration needs to be given to determine if the gaps between vehicles arriving in the opposing lane will allow the overtaking vehicles to complete the maneuver. So we've got a little diagram of that on the bottom, which kind of shows the time it would take to actually undertake this, and then also the distances. So it's partly based on AADT, but also on platooning of vehicles, and headway counts should be undertaken to determine that. So up in the top right there, we've got the different overtaking requirements, and we'll be talking about this in a lot more detail shortly. We've got an example of how to undertake these overtaking assessments. So this is just more providing what that new guidance is, and then we'll kind of walk you through how to do it a little bit more in detail shortly. All right, so I'll just take a little bit of a break there before we move on to those examples that I mentioned before, just to answer any questions. And I know we did go through that a little bit quickly, but it's, yeah, it was more just to outline that new guidance, and then the examples will kind of provide a lot more in-depth detail.
Thanks, Kieran. It seems like everybody's been listening to you quite intently, so we don't have any questions at the moment, so we'll keep moving, but everyone please use the chat box and put in any questions you may have.
Yeah, more than happy to answer any questions that do come up. And yeah, I guess a lot of this stuff that was mentioned is quite similar to what's out there already, just albeit with the additions of unsealed roads, really. All right. So like in a lot of the other slides that are in the other sessions I presented, we've got two examples that we're going to work through. So the first example, we'll be looking at approach sight distances and how to use a little bit of the new guidance. And then the second one will be overtaking in an opposing lane. So this will look at using the guide to determine if access is suitable, and then if access is not suitable, what mitigating methods can be used to grant access, and that's typically done through that route assessment process. So let's jump into our first example. So this is the assessment of the approach sight distance. So in this, additional considerations need to be taken if the intersection is after a curve or on a curve. We also need to consider substandard curves and consideration of low radii curves as well. And then we'll also look at any mitigating treatments if it doesn't meet the guidance. So for this example, we're going to be looking at assessing for a B-double vehicle access on this rural sealed road. So I guess the questions are, how do we assess the ASD required on straights and curves? What happens if it does not meet the values in the guidelines? And then how do we grant access using a risk assessment? So here we've already kind of measured what our approach sight distance is for this. So there is actually a T-junction at the end of this road where there is a hold line. So we've measured 195 meters to that hold line. And now we're going to just check what the recommended guidance is for that. So obviously we want to assess against the relevant table in the guidelines. So this is an unconstrained environment. So we use the stopping sight distance values from section 10.10.1 of the guide, or table 10.21, which is safe stopping distance for sealed roads. Again, we've got what our measured values are on the left there. So our vehicle is the B-double. Our operating speed is 80 kilometers per hour, and there was a bit of a downhill grade, so about 3%. And our measured approach sight distance was 195 meters. So once we put all that information into the table on the right there, we can see that the recommended ASD is 175 meters. So we've actually met that requirement, which is fantastic. So that means that that vehicle should be able to stop safely within that distance. So what about if the intersection was on a curve though? So we then have to consider the following. So the approach speed to the curve, the operating speed of the curve, and then also the radius of the curve. So this takes into account a lot more things in here. So the first thing that we want to do is try and work out what those approach distances are, what the radius of our curve is, and what our approach and operating speeds are. So I've just used some near map imagery here to work out what the radius of that curve is. So we've estimated it to be about 300 meters. And then we've also got a little image here on the right, and for whatever reason that giveaway sign was blurred out, so I just put a little bit of an image there so you could see that it actually is there. And then it's also got our measured distances. So for curves, one of the first things that we want to do is really determine if it's classified as a substandard curve in the guidelines. So this is, I think, something that we actually touched on yesterday. So it's looking at the speed difference between the approach speed and the curve operating speed. So if the speed difference is greater than 15 kilometers per hour, then it's classified as a substandard curve, and it requires us to use a slightly different table in the guide that accounts for a lower deceleration rate. So in this instance, our approach speed is 80 kilometers per hour, and our operating speed on that curve is 60 kilometers per hour. So what that means is we now have a speed differential of 20 kilometers per hour, which is greater than that 15 kilometers per hour recommended speed. So we do have to use the the guide for the substandard curves. So all those tables are provided in Appendix H.2, and we'll have a look at that in a second. So now our next step is to calculate, or not calculate, but find out what our intended stopping sight distance should be for that curve. So again, we have to assess against the relevant table in the guidelines. So we are using that substandard curve. So we use the stopping sight distance values from Appendix G.2.1. And again, our vehicle is still that B-double. The operating speed is 60 kilometers per hour, and the grade is flat. So our curb radius is also 300 meters. And when we plug all these values in, the guide is essentially telling us that for a 60-kilometer operating speed on a B double route at a 0% grade, it's 115 meters that were required. However, one of the notes on these tables is that if the stopping distance on a curve with a radius of less than 400 meters occurs, then we should be increasing the distance that we need by 10%. And that's to account for that reduced deceleration rate as well. So what that means is that our approach sight distance doesn't actually meet the requirements. So the guide recommends that we have 126 meters of stopping sight distance, and we only have 110. So worst case scenario, that vehicle tries to stop and about 10 meters of it is hanging out onto the lane. So that's definitely not something that we want. So from this, we know that there is an issue and we can run a risk assessment process to determine if there's a way for us to mitigate the risk of this occurring or if we can eliminate that risk altogether. So what we know is that our approach sight distance does not meet the required distance in the guide. So we have a road geometry issue. Our safety hazard is the unsafe ASD. And I guess the description of that is that there is an increased risk of the vehicle not stopping before that hold line and colliding with other vehicles that are coming on the other road. So the guide doesn't really have any additional provisions that can be provided around this. So I know when we were talking about formation widths, there were a few additional provisions that we could check to see if we can grant access based on that. So this section does not have anything like that. So we do have to use the risk assessment process to determine what our risks are and how to mitigate those. So we've already identified our risk there. And when we look at our risk rating, again, you know, the likelihood of it happening is unlikely because it is quite close to the recommended guidance. However, the severity would be major. So we end up with a moderate level of risk. So again, the risk evaluation model recommends that risk mitigation be undertaken by changing the likelihood or changing the consequences of the risk. And you can see that in that table on the bottom right, which kind of shows you what type of treatment options you should be looking at. And as we've discussed in a few of the previous sessions, so any treatments that we do choose should be made based on the principles of treating risk, which means that we should be prioritizing the most severe risks first. We should be balancing the costs and requirements of treatment. We should involve any relevant stakeholders in the decision. And we should be careful of any secondary risks caused by any treatments that are implemented. So like in the previous examples, we've come up with a few treatment options, and in this case, we've still got those 3 treatment options of speed, signage, infrastructure. So the speed one is to limit vehicle speeds as a condition of access. Signage is to erect signage warning drivers of the curve ahead and to reduce speed. And then the third one is to change the road geometry to have a larger radius and more sight distance. So in this instance, signage would most likely be our most optimal solution. And we would use that signage to reduce the approach speed to the curb to an acceptable level. So if we actually lower that approach speed, then it would mean that that curve would no longer be treated as a substandard curve. So if we put in some of this signage options here, so things like slow down, there's a curve ahead, potentially a rollover risk. If we added those signage, that signage in prior to that curve, then we could, change what the approach speed is. So instead of having an approach speed of, say, 80 kilometers, we could have it as 70, which would change our speed differential. So with that speed differential in mind, we no longer have that substandard curve. So we can just use the normal stopping sight distance from table 10.21. And what this means is basically we can calculate for a different value. So here we're actually calculating a recommended stopping sight distance or approach sight distance of 100 meters. We still do need to take into account the fact that the radius is less than 400 meters. So we do still need to apply that 10% on top of that. So the recommended guidance is saying that we need 110 meters of approach sight distance, which is great because that's exactly what we have. So there is ways of using that risk assessment process to implement those changes and then going back and checking the guide to see what is now possible. And in this case, we added that signage, changed the curve type to a normal curve, and then we were able to use a different set of criteria to assess that route. And in the end, we've ended up reducing the risks quite significantly. And now access on that road is more valid, and we can probably provide access to that. All right, so that brings us to the end of the first example. So I'll just take some questions before we move on to the example looking at overtaking in the opposing lane. Isabella, have we had any questions come through?
Hey, Kieran, everybody must be saving them right to the end. We don't have any at the moment, so we'll keep moving.
All right, geez, at this rate, we might actually finish a little bit early. All right, so our second example is overtaking in the opposing lane. So we'll also look a little bit at overtaking opportunities, the establishment of sight distance, the continuation sight distance required, and then also the available headway to make that maneuver. So I guess let's jump into that. So like normal, we're just going to assess for a B-double vehicle on this rural stretch of road. So again, our questions to ourselves: how do we assess overtaking opportunities? How do we assess overtaking in the opposing lane? What happens if it does not meet the values? And how do we grant access using a risk assessment? So from the guidelines, overtaking opportunities can be determined using either the trial assessment method or using table 10.40, which is shown on the right here. So for this example, we're just going to use the criteria from table 10.40, which more looks at the average distance between overtaking opportunities and then also the maximum distance between overtaking opportunities. And it's also determined based on the AADT. So we're going to jump into that now. So the very first thing that we really need to do is determine our passenger car equivalent AADT. So to do that, we've provided table 10.41, which kind of shows you how to convert into passenger car equivalents. And it's typically as simple as breaking down your AADT into different vehicle types and then applying the PCE factor that's shown in the table. So there's two different factors. There's one for flat terrain and one for rolling terrain. So in this example, we're just going to be using the flat terrain. If we go back to that photo, you know, we can see that that's a fairly flat section of road. So yeah, it uses the AADT of multiple vehicle classes multiplied by the PCE factor to determine what our actual passenger car equivalent is. So we've provided a little bit of an example of that in the bottom right table there. It shows what our AADTs are in that center column and what factor it needs to be multiplied by, and then it shows what the resulting PCE is. So in the end, we ended up with a PCE AADT of 515. Our next thing that we need to look at is the overtaking opportunities. So this is actually measuring how many, or the frequency of those overtaking lanes or opportunities, what the distance is between them, and what the average distance is between them, and what the maximum distance is between them. So I've tried to provide a bit of an example here that's relatively easy to understand. So we've got 3 overtaking sections which are 1.2 kilometers long. So those are the green arrows that are on the road there. And then I've also shown what the distances are between those. So we've got a 1.2k overtaking lane and then 2.1 kilometers of road between them. So all we had to really do is just work out what our maximum distance was between the overtaking. So we can see there that it was 3.9. And then we also need to work out what our average distance between overtaking is, which ended up being 4.05, which I think I have also counted into a few other things. So then from that, we essentially just need to assess against the table. So table 10.40, which we saw before. And like usual, plug in our values that we had. So the fact that we're using a B double doesn't really matter in this situation. Our AADT with the PCE factor applied does count. So we've got 515, so we use that. And then we put in our average overtaking opportunities and our maximum overtaking opportunities. So we can see there that the values for both of those are well below the recommended. So that's actually great. So then the second part of this is to actually look at the overtaking in the opposing lane. So this is kind of built up on 3 different measurements. So we've got the establishment sight distance, or ESD, the continuation sight distance, or CSD, and then we've also got the average headway between vehicles in the opposing lane, which we're just going to call that headway. So at the bottom there, you can kind of see that there is a bit of a diagram that does show these different stages, you know, where the vehicle is at the start, where it moves to, what the overtaking continuation sight distance is, all of that stuff. So it does provide a relatively good example of how to undertake this. So for this example, we're just going to walk through these three stages of determining if overtaking in the opposing lane is suitable. And the requirements for it being suitable is that it meets the guidance for all 3 of those. So the first one that we're looking at here is the establishment sight distance. So we've got the table on the bottom here, and this is just an extract of that. So it does have additional speed ratings or operating speeds that you can assess against. We've just cut it down for the purpose of this, so it all fits on the one page. And like usual, you know, we are assessing for that B double. We have set our speed limit as 80 kilometers per hour. And we've gone out and we've measured our establishment sight distance. So now we need to check that against what's recommended in the guide. So when we plug those values into the table, we can see that the guide is recommending us 740 meters as the minimum establishment sight distance, which we've actually exceeded, which is great. And then we've also got a bit of a figure at the bottom there, which shows like how to measure that establishment sight distance. So this distance is measured based on the vehicle, which is the blue vehicle, in its lane, and when it is able to see, well, how far it is able to see down the road to determine if a vehicle is coming. So we've got those orange vehicles as the vehicles coming in the opposing direction, and then just the B double vehicle. And we'll see this same figure in the next couple of slides as well, visualizing the other two criteria. So the next one is the continuation sight distance. So this is very similar to the previous one with a few slight tweaks. If we look at the figure on the bottom, so the continuation sight distance is once that vehicle has moved out into the oncoming lane, how much distance or how much sight distance it has at which any oncoming vehicle can be seen when it's doing that overtaking maneuver. So it is similar to the previous one, but with some caveats there. And again, we've measured what our continuation sight distance would be, and we've come up with 560 meters. And then we check what the recommended value is, which turned out to be 400, so that passes as well. And then the final one is the average headway. So this one is more looking at how frequently those vehicles are actually traveling along that road. So we can see here at the bottom, we've got that figure again, and we've got the orange vehicle. So we've got 3 of them here, and we're estimating that the average time between those vehicles passing the blue vehicle is about 45 seconds. So that's what we classify as the average headway between vehicles in the opposing lane. So this is more looking at how long would it take for that vehicle, the blue vehicle, to overtake that B double vehicle. So we're saying that it would, so it would have enough space there. Sorry. So yeah, when we actually measure that, the recommended guidance is that it would take is that there needs to be 33 seconds of average headway between the vehicles, and our vehicle is able to clear that in 29 seconds. So there's, it's pretty close, but it is making it. And we've actually measured that for that stretch of road, the headway between those vehicles is actually 50 seconds. So that's more than enough to be able to actually clear that distance. All right, so in summary of all that, really, so from the assessment, we found out that there was adequate overtaking opportunities at regular intervals. So the average distance between overtaking opportunities was less than 15 kilometers, which in this case is actually a good thing. Usually in a lot of the other stuff we've been looking at, you want to be bigger than that number, but not in this case. So we want to have more overtaking opportunities more frequently. And again, the maximum distance between overtaking opportunities, so in this case was less, which again was a good thing in this case, because we don't want to have as much of a distance between them. And then the summary of the actual overtaking the opposing lane. So again, from the assessment, the available overtaking opportunities in the opposing lane was found to be adequate. So the establishment sight distance was greater than the 740 meters that was recommended in the guide. continuation sight distance was greater than 400 meters, and the average headway between the vehicles in the opposing lane was greater than the 33 seconds that was recommended. So yeah, so that pretty much brings us to the end of that example, and really the end of the session, which we're actually 10 minutes ahead, which is strange. So I'll just I'll see if there's any questions that have come through. Isabella, any questions?
Yeah, Kieran, we've had 2 questions come through. One is from Tony, and they've asked, is the TRARR only available through ARB?
I believe so. I'd actually have to double check with Dave if that's an open source program or not.
Yeah, Kieran, I'm not too sure on the status of that. So ARB developed the program back in the 80s, and we gave it a good revamp a few years ago, and it's been put into a new software platform and package. We can check in and let you know, but yeah, I'm not clear on that either. But we definitely do regular assessments in TRAR, and we sort of continually improve the package as well. So, but no, I'm not too sure whether it's available yet.
Yeah, that's something that we'll probably have to double check on. I guess there probably are some other software packages out there that people can use if they want to. It really depends on if it provides that level of service kind of guarantee.
No worries,
No, actually,
thanks, Kieran.
yeah, at the moment, TRAR is the only package that does it, which is why we've been reinvesting in it. And I guess just to expand on the use of TRAR, so so Kieran went through the example there where you could use the frequency of overtaking opportunities, but whilst that meets the criteria in the table and the guide, it's a pretty high level, I guess, way to capture what the level of service might be. When you have roads with, particularly with undulating terrain, it is beneficial, and you've got reasonably high levels of traffic flow. It is beneficial to do that, go through that trial process, because it identifies really if those overtaking opportunities are in the right location, which is where the vehicle may be reducing speed, and the traffic that's on the roads had an opportunity to catch up to that heavy vehicle and become queued behind that slower moving vehicle.
Yeah, I was considering putting the TRAR assessment in here, but I didn't think we would have time to go through it. It is a bit of a lengthy process. But yeah, I believe in the guide there are some good examples of what the outputs from that are and how to use those. Any other questions, Isabella?
Yeah, we've got one from Emily, and they have asked, what differences would you expect for overtaking on gravel roads?
On gravel roads, that's probably one that I would have to pass on to Dave.
Yeah, look, I just Larry, did you have any thoughts on overtaking specifically on gravel roads?
Not many positive thoughts. I find it a bit scary trying to overtake a heavy vehicle which is throwing up lots of dust on a gravel road. Nah, no, not too many positive thoughts. Thanks.
No, that was my thoughts as well. So look, we are going through, I think I mentioned in one of the previous sessions, we've got a current project now which is looking at single lanes and 4-meter seals and interactions with multi-combination vehicles and general traffic, and it's a similar issues on those roads as well. So I wouldn't think that overtaking would be very possible on unsealed roads just because of that dust. But look, I think if you are going through a route assessment process and you've got an unsealed road where you think that the traffic volumes are high enough that overtaking may become an issue, it may well be that you can provide as a condition of access, the heavy vehicle driver has to be aware that they to pull over and let vehicles through. You could provide signage. It's really when you're starting to get into that traffic composition area, not so much just the heavy vehicle sight distance criteria. And it's really that consultation process and just trying to manage that risk, because there will ultimately be some people that do accept that higher level of risk in overtaking in those undesirable conditions with the dust. And it might also too be that you provide regular pull-over bays where the drivers can pull over if there's radio communication between general traffic and that vehicle operator. So there are other ways around how to find that balance on giving access and maintaining normal traffic operations.
Excellent, thanks, Dave. Any other questions that have come through, Isabella?
Yeah, we have a question from Lovedeep, and they have asked, what is the factor of safety that has been taken into account for the recommended distances and headway?
That's probably another one I'm going to have to pass on to Dave. I think he's more across
so
that stuff.
The headway is really just it's really the factor of safety really is inherent within the sight distances and the distance that it takes to complete that maneuver. So the headway is based on the sight distances. So there is a level of safety built in those sight distances. With regards to using that headway, it is in there as a trigger to look into the headways in further detail. So if you've depending on how you've calculated your headways, you could say, well, I've got a average daily traffic of X divided by the number of minutes and seconds in the day and come up with a headway. Or you could do a specific study where you're looking at what the traffic patterns are, whether there's platooning coming through, what the average headway is between groups of vehicles. So if you've got a sort of a high-speed local government road where there's a set of traffic lights exiting a township, well, you might end up in a situation where you'll have 5 or 6 vehicles coming through in a small group, and then there might be no vehicles at all for 2 or 3 minutes. So it's really rationalising the process of assessing that really what it's looking at is what is the reality of someone being able to overtake a vehicle using the opposing lane, even if the sight distance is there. And that's really what the whole process is all about. So there is a factor of safety in there.
Yep. Awesome,
thanks, David. We've got another question come through from Ching, and they have asked, is it this assessment taking the consideration if the blue vehicle is another B double overtaking left side B double?
I can't imagine you'd really have that happening very often. As far as I know, I don't think this takes that into consideration. Dave, can you?
No, it's just looking at. So really, it's the overtaking sight distances are from the Austroads guide. So it's and it references as such, and that guidance is based on a certain speed differential between passenger vehicles and the heavy vehicle. So it's really based on anything in the guidelines is based on what the likely scenario is, or the 85th percentile scenario. So it's really just identifying that there's a need to overtake because that heavy vehicle can't operate at the posted speed limit or the general operating speed of the traffic. So the guidance only takes into account that the heavy vehicle's traveling at a determined speed that's lower than the general operating speed. It doesn't take into account one heavy vehicle overtaking another heavy vehicle.
Yeah, I was pretty sure that was the case. Always good to double check though. Any other questions that have come through?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. This has come through from Les, and they have asked, what was your assumption for the safe distance between the car and heavy vehicle before and after the overtaking manoeuvre?
That's another one I'm going to have to pass through to Dave. Sorry, mate.
No, that's okay. Again, that's based on the nationally adopted overtaking sight distances. So there was a study, if anyone's interested, there was a study done back in either the late 70s or early 80s by Rod Troutbeck, which which developed all of this guidance, and it's an interesting read. And it's on the it's in the ARB library. So if you access the ARB library on arb.com.au, you can work your way through that.
Okay, no worries.
Perfect. Thank you, David and Kieran. Kieran, I think we'll wrap it up now. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please.
Yep, no worries.
So we'd like to thank our presenters today, and also thanks to our audience for tuning in. Our next NACOE webinar is on the 6th of August, so please check out our website. We have so much happening in the online space, and we'd love to have you join us with anything that might enhance your professional development and build your CPD points. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Isabella. And like always, I just want to thank Dave and Larry for joining me to answer some of those questions that have come through.
Pleasure, Kieran.
Yeah, pleasure, Kieran.